local requirements? Is this now a global role? I'd like to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Seema Gently, who's Managing Director of SJ Solutions. So Seema has been specialising in pharmacovigilance for over 20 years and has headed up global pharmacovigilance and medical affairs before setting up SJ Solutions. SJ Solutions services span both consulting and contracting to provide solutions to drug safety, research and other affairs relating to the running of a business within the pharmaceuticals industry. Seema, over to you.
Thank you. Hope you can hear me okay. Welcome, and I hope you're all, I know these are very challenging times, certainly for us, so I hope you're all safe and well. So today we're going to talk about, I put it really as globalization of QP requirements. I know we're talking about EU QPPV, UK to a certain degree as well, but wanted to really look at what kind of the regional requirements are and how do we manage this overall. So if we think about where we've come from, I mean, the EU QPPV came about, volume 9A was where we certainly had the first mention, and this was further consolidated by the 2012 EU legislation and then the GVP modules, probably more module 1, where there's certainly a list of exactly what is required, what the QPPV should be responsible for and have oversight of, and that was from 2012 onwards. So really what we're seeing, or what we have been seeing, is an increasing global adoption of those requirements with regards to having a qualified person, or certainly a PV responsible person at the national level. As we know, the QPPV is extremely important with regards to really having an oversight of the PV system, making sure that it's fully functioning, and that covers right from case processing all the way through aggregate reports, signal detection, right through to risk management at the local level as well. So the local requirements for PV is increasing, and the responsibility that's required. I think overall what we're seeing is that the EU QPPV has always been the gold standard, been established for many, many years. Those of you who've been in that role will know that. What we've seen coming through are variations on the role at the local level outside of the EU, but still fundamentally mirroring the EU requirements. So if we look at what the requirements are within the EU, I know again those of you who've been in this role will know this off by heart, but the EU QPPV has to be permanently, continuously available for the MAH, appropriately qualified, has to live in the EU, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, has to ensure that there are backup procedures in place so that that role can be present or can be maintained all the way through if the QPPV is not available. So you need a deputy or deputies. The QPPV needs to be responsible for the establishment and maintenance of the PV system of the marketing authorization holder with sufficient authority to influence the performance of the quality system and the pharmacovigilance activities in order to ensure that there is compliance with the legal requirements. Also needs to have access to the pharmacovigilance system master file and ensure that the information contained in there is up to date and accurate. So the QPPV does have that oversight of all the functioning of the PV system in all relevant aspects, and we know then that touches on many different functions within the organisation. Delegation is possible, but this needs to be to an appropriately qualified and trained individual or individuals, depending on what task is being delegated, and the oversight has to be maintained by the QPPV. In the EU legislation, they do talk about a contact person at national level, and that they can also be nominated as the QPPV, but there may be the requirement to have a contact person as well nationally. And if we look at the guideline, the EMA guideline that details the national requirements, we can go through the different countries and understand exactly where we do have a national requirement. So going through, we start with Austria. So here you don't, but it is advisable, as the National Competent Authority can request the nomination of a national PV contact. If we look at Belgium, yes, we do need a local person here. They need to be contactable 24/7 and need to carry out the activities in Belgium with adequate qualifications and language skills. In Bulgaria, you need a local person to assist the QPPV. Croatia, yes, you do also need a local person, as well as in Cyprus. In Czech Republic, it's more about language. So if the QPPV doesn't speak Czech or Slovak, then they need to have somebody at local level. And also, if you have an imposed obligation to collect pharmacovigilance data or a PASS or a patient support program in Czech Republic. Denmark, there isn't a requirement, but it may be requested by the National Competent Authority, although that hasn't been done to date. For Estonia, you don't, but you should have an Estonian-speaking contact person. In Finland, again, you don't need somebody, but it is recommended. The person, though, doesn't have to have a medical degree. France and Germany, we know about, we're used to, France and Germany. France, you do need somebody, needs to be a physician or pharmacist, and Germany as well. If we look at Greece, you need somebody who has excellent knowledge of English, needs to be a pharmacist or physician, or a biochemistry, a biochemical degree, or in biology, chemistry, a dentist or a nurse with 2 years experience. And they shouldn't have any relation there to marketing or to commercial. If you're in Hungary, if the QPPV is outside of Hungary, then you will need somebody within Hungary who reports to the EU QPPV, and they should have a degree in life sciences, be a chemist, chemical engineer, and they should be trained in PV as well. Iceland, Ireland, there isn't a requirement. Italy, there isn't a requirement if the QPPV knows Italian. For Latvia, if the QPPV is outside Latvia, then the contact person needs to reside and work in Latvia and again report it into the EU QPPV. Lithuania may request. Luxembourg, you do need a local person, and Malta, you don't. Sorry, I know this is a bit of a list, but it is quite interesting to see exactly where there is and where there aren't requirements within the EU. So the Netherlands, if your QPPV is outside of the Netherlands or doesn't speak and write Dutch, then you would need to have somebody who would report to the EU QPPV and who is knowledgeable with regards to the Dutch legislation, guidelines and procedures. They need to be medically qualified or certainly have access to a medic and with good backup procedures as well. So Norway, we don't. Poland, yes, you do, needs to live or have an office in Poland with the same obligations as the EU QPPV and speak Polish. Portugal, you need a local person who reports against the QPPV. Romania may be requested, again reporting to the QPPV. And Slovakia, you need somebody with a good understanding, skills in PV, understands the relevant legislation and guidelines and can communicate appropriately in Slovak or Czech. So they can live out of Slovakia, but they do need to work there. Slovenia, no, although this can be requested, and Spain does have a requirement and Sweden doesn't. So I think you can see, you know, from the list overall that whilst we do have the overarching EU QPV role, there are a number of local requirements within the EU that do need to be met. And these do need to be considered when we're thinking about our overall EU strategy for product approval and where resource should be set. If there is, obviously, there are always limitations to resource, but if there are limitations to the amount of resource that is available for PV, and I think one thing that is quite clear is there does need to be people that do have an understanding of the legislation, who understands and are trained appropriately within PV. So you can't just nominate somebody and put them into a position without having that experience and understanding of what's required for PV, where a local QPPV person is required. So I wanted to look at some of the other territories as well. So if we look at the League of Arab States, so these are 22 countries and territories, they've come up with the GVP for Arab countries. It's a common guideline, and really use the, sorry, I can't get rid of this in the corner. That may just have to stay. So they've used the EU GBP as a basis for their common guideline, and it is very, very similar. It has almost lifted, almost word for word, the GBP, EU GBP modules. And here you do have a QPPV, or local safety responsible requirement, and these are the countries where that is a requirement. So we've got Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Oman, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. And so, you can see within the Arab states, we're moving towards, or have moved towards, that QPPV requirement, and then certainly having local safety representation as well in some of those territories as well. So when we look at the GBP for Arab countries, it's very similar to the EU. So again, permanently, continuously at its disposal, properly qualified QPPV in the Arab country concerned. If there is a multinational marketing authorization holder, then you could have a local safety responsible in some Arab countries, but here the recommendation is to look at the national requirements, and then we're required to submit the name and contact details of either the QPPV and or the local safety responsible to those national medicines authorities. They do detail that this is a full-time job. The duties should be defined in a job description, and they need to be fully dedicated to their job as a QPPV or LSR. So really, again, pointing towards the fact that this shouldn't be just a cursory appointment of somebody who, they've kind of thrown in maybe to that role to fulfill an obligation. It needs to be somebody that is dedicated and aware of their responsibilities. So they do also state, though, that if you have a multinational MAH, in addition to the headquarter QPPV, the national medicines authorities can request the nomination of a PV contact person, so the local safety responsible in each concerned Arab country. They can report to the QPPV for PV tasks, but the responsibility, PV tasks and responsibilities, but not necessarily the line management aspect, which can be then within the local level. The contact person at national level could also be the local safety responsible, and the MAH shall ensure, again, that the QPPV has that authority to influence the PV system, and that they have enough support and are high enough up in the organisation to be able to fulfil their responsibilities. So you can see, again, very similar to the EU, especially with regards to responsibilities and the ability to fulfil them. So very clear with regards to what's required. If we look at the United Arab Emirates, we do have a little bit more with regards to the QPPV role or the LSR role and what the expectation is. So you'd need to submit the names and the 24-hour contact details of the nominated QPPV and the alternate, the deputy during absence, and tells you where to submit that. They also need to ensure that the MAH has the acquired theoretical and practical knowledge to be able to perform their activities, and they need to have a bachelor degree in pharmacy or medicine. And if they do have, some training in epidemiology and biostats, that's also helpful as well. Now, to get QPPV approval, it's a little more detailed. You need to provide a letter of appointment from the company, not any of the agents that are operating within the UAE, a training certificate in PV, an experience certificate in PV, a list of products that are covered, ADR case reports, and that would be in the last year of the local company, and SOP of the PV officer, as well as the graduation certificate. So you can see here there's a lot more evidence that's having to be presented to show that you do have a fully fledged and appropriate QPPV within the UAE. So if we're moving around the world now, but if we move to the Eurasian Economic Union, the EEU, and this covers Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenia, I can't pronounce this, Kyrgyzstan, sorry, apologies for that, I should have known how to pronounce that, just had a mental blank there. So here the QPPV should be designated in the Eurasian Economic Union countries, and they should undergo training as well on the PV system of the MAH. And on the next slide, I will just present, again, the details. Oh, apologies, not quite sure what's happened to this slide. We'll amend that. The MAH must assign a QPPV, again, constantly available in the member states. Doesn't have to be a physician or pharmacist, and natural science degree is acceptable. The MAH, as we said, needs to train with regards to the PV system, and this is done, though, through expert organisations, and here is Scientific Centre for Expert Evaluation of Medicinal Products. They provide the training and issue certificates for QPPV qualification. They have to reside in the territory of the Eurasian Economic Union member states. They need one QPPV for one system. Regulatory authorities, though, of the other member states can also ask for a contact person at the national level. So again, mirroring the EU, and they should report into the QPPV. Responsibilities are very similar to the EU, so establishing, maintaining, managing the MAH PV system, having the authority over the PV system, and control of the functioning of every aspect of the PV system as well. You can see here that a QPPV should be directly subordinate to the MAH CEO. So again, highlighting the fact of where the QPPV sits within the organization. And it should be independent of the heads of other departments, including clinical and marketing. So again, it's very much highlighting that this is a key position within the organization. So if the last bit is a bit difficult to read there, but it does say that there is a statutory possibility to delegate MAH PV authority, including the functions of the QPPV, to another entity organisation, and that's, I believe, relatively new and just been added in. So you can outsource where appropriate, and that's when you have a few products and the maintenance of the PV system for an MAH is unreasonably expensive. So if we move now to the ASEAN countries, so there is a requirement for a local person or a QPPV. This is in Indonesia, Philippines, and Singapore. And they should be responsible for product safety, and that includes adverse drug reactions, that's specifically mentioned. The QPPV must have a residential status for Singapore and Indonesia, but for the Philippines, it's not mandatory that they reside within the Philippines. So within Latin America, so we have the Pan-American Network on Drug Regulatory Harmonization. So in Argentina, it's mandatory to appoint a representative for PV, and they are there to communicate with the health authority. And in Chile, the technical director is responsible for PV, but you can have an external advisor, and again, doesn't necessarily have to be a pharmacist. And in Brazil, there isn't a requirement. So within Australia, the QPPV is in Australia is responsible for the undertakings there with regards to pharmacovigilance. Ideally, sorry about this. This should also be the, oh God, I am having a nightmare. Right. Ideally, also they can be the Australian. They should be the Australian PV contact person as well. And the recommendation here is that they live in Australia, that they are available permanently and continuously, but at least for the applicable kind of working time frame for Australia, so 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday to Friday, and they do have backup as well. They should be trained and experienced on the relevant Australian legislation, and they need to be medically qualified or access to a medic. And they prefer that if they are a medic, that they reside in Australia and that they're medically registered there as well. So again, those are recommendations though with regards to that role. It's not an absolute requirement in Australia to meet these requirements here listed. So New Zealand again recommends a contact person be nominated, and again located where can be contacted in the appropriate time frame and time zones for New Zealand, and again access to a medic. If we look at India, so India have just kind of started to look at their own PV legislation. The national legislation has been implemented, and you need to have a PV officer in charge, who has authority over the PV system and is responsible for compliance as well. They can be a medic or a pharmacist, and they should be trained in the collection and analysis of adverse drug reactions. So here, I just wanted to touch very briefly on the UK QPPV. I know there had been a big flurry of activity. Certainly we've left the EU as of the 31st of January. Now, this was what the recommendation was, certainly if there's a no-deal exit. When you look, though, now at recommendations, the guidance has been withdrawn, and that was towards the end of February. So it points you towards basically the EMA for current information on the QPPV. So we're waiting for updated guidance with regards to how this should be managed. But really we are heading, of course, towards the UK QPPV. We need further details. This was what was in place, that we will have until the end of 2020 or 21 months from exit day. Exit day was the end of January, so that would take us to October 2021. But really, I think it's very difficult at this moment to know exactly what this is going to look like. The roles and response look like in the sense in relation to when this needs to be put into place. The roles and responsibilities are clear, very similar, equivalent to the EU QPPV as detailed here. And one thing to bear in mind is that there will be the UK specific PSMF as well to consider. So just wanted to touch on the activities really for local QPPV. So why are we looking at, having local responsible people for PV? What's the benefit? What do they need to do? Well, local literature, we know certainly from an EU perspective is extremely important, and in other territories as well, to understand what's going on at ground level, at local level. Regulatory intelligence is extremely important. They act as that in between for the National Competence Authority as well as the global organisation to ensure that the global organisation is aware of what's required, what's going on, and can support local legislation, guidelines and requirements appropriately. They may need local registration. They do have that in-depth understanding of what the local PV activities and needs are, and translate that information, transfer that information appropriately within the organisation. Again, you could have safety issues that are occurring at local level, which then that are important from a global perspective as well, and that needs to be communicated back to global. So an understanding of what's going on at the local level from a safety issue perspective. Local compliance is important because, again, globally you want to put in your compliance aspects, but you need to ensure that they're being adhered to appropriately at the local level. You may need support for local submission documents such as your risk management plans, your risk minimization activities, to ensure that they're appropriate and fit for purpose at the local level and really supportive of the product and the healthcare system locally. Also, translation and ADR follow-up, having someone at the local level is very important for that. And also being able to understand and change the PV system to fit what they require at the local level. And that can certainly be a big challenge overall and can be difficult to manage. So if we look at the challenges, so I think really, you can see that we have a lot of QPPVs in different regions, in different territories, very similar responsibilities. And the responsibilities overall with regards to kind of maintaining, establishing the PV system, albeit at the regional level, but these all feed into the global system. And the global system itself needs to ensure that their compliance at national and regional level is met. And I think here that's where your governance process is really, really important. You need to have that in place to ensure that you have a mechanism for discussion and agreement on competing requirements, or where perhaps one territory needs something done a certain way and that's not necessarily how another territory would need that done. So there needs to be that governance structure to ensure that they can have that discussion and agreement, and you have something that's fit for purpose at all the regional levels, and that everybody can be supported. If you look at the organisation of the PV department, it used to be very heavy on the EU QPPV perspective, looking at the EU requirements. It still is, certainly to a great degree. However, we are probably shifting away slightly, and we have always been global, but we're looking at what the regional QPPV requirements are and how do we bring that in. So you need that global overview with full oversight of what's going on and what the requirements are at the regional level, and not just focusing on the needs of the EU QPPV. With the PSMF, with the guidelines that have been implemented in the different areas, there are requirements for other PSMFs, not just the EU one, and again would probably move more towards a global PSMF with regional aspects to the PSMF that can then meet the requirements at the local levels and ensure then there is compliance from that perspective as well. I think importantly, though, when we're looking at our overall regulatory strategy, launch plans, especially for companies that are setting up, that are moving into different territories, need to think strategically how best to use the resources that we do have. And that's where we need to look at where there is a requirement for local representation and how that local representation can maybe support other territories as well. If resource is an issue in the sense that you don't have someone in every single country where you are looking to market and launch. So for example, I've put here Denmark may be used to cover Sweden and Norway. So you have someone that's sitting in Denmark, whilst that's not a requirement as such, but it is recommended to have someone there. They can also cover other territories where they don't have that requirement for a local representative. And I think it's very important to really understand where those requirements are and to really use the resources that are available appropriately. And I think keeping up to date with local requirements is of course a challenge. As you can see, there's been a plethora of different guidelines that have come out in all of the different territories, and actually it's quite difficult to find that information. Having people at local level, though, will help and assist with that and ensure that you're kept up to date with what those requirements are. But it is a challenge to find that information and ensure that you are doing the right thing. So just to conclude, I think overall you can see that the requirements for local QPPVs, sorry, I don't know how it should just shut automatically, but anyway, requirements for local QPPVs and LSOs are increasing globally. And when you look at the requirements, yes, it is about having that oversight of the PV system, being able to ensure there is compliance, being able to ensure that the PV system is functioning appropriately and is fit for purpose. But it's also about language as well, and ensuring that communication at the local level is done in the best way and managed in the best way, and understanding what the local legislation is as well. Time management is also, I think, an issue. If you look at Australia, New Zealand, time zones are important, and having, again, support within the time zone is key. There is that increasing importance of local representation within PV, but I think you can see very much focusing on additional responsibility and really ensuring that there are people who understand PV and have that experience, expertise, knowledge and training and the right qualifications to provide that support. I think we all know that PV is about collective responsibility, but now it's also about understanding what happens at ground level and bringing that all together to ensure that globally product can be managed appropriately and the safety of the product can be managed appropriately. Overall, I think connectivity will be increased and strengthened and is already. And it is important to have that local representation. Even when there isn't that direct requirement, it's important to understand what's happening at ground level, because that's the way that you'll understand what's happening with your product overall globally. And I've just put a caveat here. It is really important to always check national requirements. I've put in here what I know, but you know, don't just use this and use it to put your local kind of people in place. Just make sure that everything is double checked appropriately, because things do change quite rapidly. And I think I will leave that there and ask if there are any questions. Okay, it seems that there aren't any questions. Do come back to me if you would like any further information with regards to the regional requirements. What I can do when we send the links out, I do have, I'll send a slide out as well with the links to the different guidelines so that you can have them available to you too. So for Eurasia, for the Arab countries as well, and for Latin America. So I will end it there. Thank you very much for listening, and stay safe.